A half-blood Hidatsa tracker found a chained woman caged at a frontier auction for $3 and gave her his protection, his name, and a choice that would either save them both or destroy everything they'd ever known. The sun hung like a merciless eye over Bitter Creek Trading Post, Montana Territory. In the scorching summer of 1876, heat waves danced off the wooden planks of the ramshackle buildings, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with malice. The trading post squatted at the confluence of two rivers like a festering wound on the landscape, drawing the worst kind of men from hundreds of miles around. Trappers with wild eyes and wilder beards, cattle rustlers with blood still under their fingernails, prospectors who'd lost their souls in played-out claims, and merchants who'd sell their own mothers if the price was right.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The building that served as both warehouse and auction house had once been a granary, its weathered walls still bearing the ghost scent of wheat and barley. But today it held a different kind of cargo, and the crowd that gathered outside buzzed with the particular energy that came when human dignity was about to be bartered away like livestock. Men spat tobacco juice into the dust and adjusted their gun belts, while a few women in faded calico dresses whispered behind their hands, their faces pinched with the kind of righteousness that made cruelty feel like virtue. Tobias Stormwind had not planned to stop at Bitter Creek. He'd been tracking a band of horse thieves for 3 weeks, following their trail through the Badlands and broken country north of the Yellowstone River. His saddlebags held jerky and hardtack. His canteen was half empty, and his buckskin gelding needed rest and grain. The trading post was meant to be nothing more than a brief stop to resupply before continuing his pursuit. But as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, the sound of the auctioneer's voice carried on the hot wind, and something in the tone made his blood run cold. "Do I hear $2? $2 for this fine specimen of native craftsmanship?" The words hit Tobias like a physical blow. He'd heard that particular combination of words before, in his nightmares and in the stories his grandmother had whispered to him as a child. Stories of the times when their people had been hunted, captured, and sold like animals. He'd hoped those days were behind them, buried with the treaties and the promises of peace. But hope, he'd learned, was a luxury that men like him couldn't afford. He pushed through the crowd, his tall frame parting the sea of unwashed bodies like a ship cutting through muddy water. The men gave way reluctantly, some recognizing the dangerous stillness in his gray eyes, others simply sensing that this was not a man to be trifled with. His mixed heritage was written in the sharp angles of his face, the bronze of his skin, and the way he moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Some called him half-breed behind his back, others whispered that he was the devil's own spawn, but none dared say it to his face. Inside the sweltering warehouse, the source of the bidding sat in a cage that had been hastily welded together from scrap iron and wagon parts. The bars were thick as a man's thumb, and the lock was the kind used for storing gunpowder and gold. She was young, perhaps 21, with the kind of beauty that belonged to open skies and running water rather than iron cages and auction blocks. Her skin was the color of honey touched by firelight, and her hair fell in 2 long braids that had been decorated with beads and feathers before some bastard had torn half of them away. But it was her eyes that stopped Tobias cold. They were the color of storm clouds, dark and turbulent, and they held a fury that hadn't been broken despite everything that had been done to her. Blood had dried at the corner of her mouth, and her left cheek bore the purple shadow of a recent blow. Her wrists were bound with leather cords that had been pulled so tight they'd cut into her skin, and her ankles were shackled with iron chains that had rubbed her flesh raw. $3, called out a voice from the crowd. $3 for the squaw. The auctioneer, a ferret-faced man with greasy hair and gold teeth, grinned like a skull. $3 from the gentleman in the brown hat. Do I hear 4? Tobias felt his hands curl into fists. The woman in the cage hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged the bidding. She sat perfectly still, her back straight and her chin raised, as if she were a queen holding court rather than a prisoner being sold to the highest bidder. But Tobias could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed against her palms, the slight tremor that ran through her when the auctioneer's voice grew louder. "What's her name?" Tobias called out, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. The auctioneer squinted at him, taking in the buckskin shirt, the beadwork on his belt, the way his dark hair was braided with strips of leather and silver. "Name's Kira Moonhawk, according to the manifest. Hidatsa, captured 3 weeks ago during the settlement raid up north. She's got skills in healing and horse training, if you're looking for more than just entertainment." A few men in the crowd chuckled at the implication, but Tobias didn't. Smile. He'd heard about the raid on the Hidatsa settlement. A group of renegade soldiers and civilian volunteers had attacked a peaceful village, claiming they were rooting out hostiles. In reality, they'd been looking for anything of value they could steal or sell. The fact that they'd taken captives meant the raid had been even worse than the report suggested. $4, shouted another bidder, a heavy-set man with a Confederate campaign hat and a face like a boiled ham. $4, and I'll throw in a bottle of whiskey for the seller. The auctioneer's grin widened. $4 from Colonel Briggs. Do I hear 5? Tobias stepped closer to the cage, close enough to see the way Kira's nostrils flared when she caught his scent. Her eyes flicked to his face for just a moment, and he saw something there that made his chest tighten. Not hope, exactly, but recognition. She knew what he was, could smell the mixed blood in him, just as he could smell the fear and rage that she kept locked behind her proud facade. "She's hurt," he said quietly, not to the auctioneer but to her. "Your shoulder." Kira's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't respond. Her left shoulder was held at an awkward angle, and Tobias could see the way she favored it when she shifted position. Someone had either dislocated it or broken her collarbone, and the injury hadn't been properly treated. $5. "Colonel," Briggs called out again, his voice slurred with drink. $5, and I'll take her off your hands right now." The crowd was getting restless, and Tobias could feel the mood shifting. These men hadn't come here to watch a civilized auction. They'd come to see a spectacle, to participate in something that would give them stories to tell in saloons and brothels for months to come. The longer the bidding went on, the more likely it was that someone would decide to take matters into their own hands. Tobias reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He'd been saving the money inside for months, planning to buy supplies for the winter and maybe a new rifle to replace the one that had been damaged in his last encounter with claim jumpers. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. $10, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the warehouse. The crowd went silent. $10 was more than most of these men saw in a month, more than they'd expected anyone to bid for a single captive. The auctioneer's eyes went wide, and even Colonel Briggs stopped in the middle of raising his hand for another bid. $10 from the half-breed. The auctioneer called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Do I hear 11? Tobias watched Kira's face carefully. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her hands relax slightly, the white-knuckle grip on her own. Wrists loosening just a fraction. She was listening now, not just enduring. 11. Colonel Briggs roared, his face turning purple with indignation. $11, and I'll throw in a horse. The bidding continued, climbing higher as more men joined in. Tobias watched his meager savings being outmatched dollar by dollar, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known this was a long shot, but he'd had to try. The alternative was watching this woman be sold to men who would use her until she broke, and then discard her like a worn-out tool. $15. Called out a new voice, and Tobias turned to see a tall man in a black suit pushing through.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The crowd. The newcomer had the pale, soft look of someone who'd never done an honest day's work in his life, and his eyes held the kind of calculating coldness that Tobias had learned to recognize in slave traders and flesh peddlers. $15 from Mr. Dalton. The auctioneer called out gleefully. Do I hear 16? Tobias felt his heart sink. Dalton was known throughout the territory as a man who specialized in the kind of business that decent people didn't talk about. He ran a string of establishments that catered to the baser appetites of miners and soldiers, and the women who worked for him rarely lived long enough to see their freedom. 16. Colonel Briggs countered, but his voice lacked conviction. Even drunk, he could recognize when he was outmatched. $20, Dalton said smoothly, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. $20 cash in hand. The warehouse fell silent, except for the buzzing of flies and the distant sound of horses stamping their feet in the heat. $20 was a fortune in this part of the country. Enough to buy a good horse and saddle, or supplies for a month. No one else would be able to match it. Tobias looked at Kira one more time, and saw that she was looking back at him. Her storm cloud eyes held a message that he understood with perfect clarity. She would rather die than be sold to Dalton, and she was asking him to understand that choice. He nodded slightly, just enough for her to see. Then he reached into his boot and pulled out a small folding knife, the kind used for skinning rabbits and cutting rope. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was sharp, and it was all he had. Going once. The auctioneer called out, his voice rising with excitement. Going twice. Tobias stepped forward, closer to the cage. The crowd was focused on Dalton now, watching the well-dressed man count out gold coins with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before. No one was paying attention to the half-breed who'd been priced out of the bidding. Going 3 times, sold to Mr. Dalton for $20. The crowd erupted in cheers and catcalls, but Tobias barely heard them. He was watching Kira's face, seeing the way her composure finally began to crack. A single tear rolled down her cheek, cutting a clean track through the dust and dried blood. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for whatever came next. Dalton pushed through the crowd toward the cage, his coins jingling in his hand and a satisfied smile on his face. He was already talking to the auctioneer about transportation arrangements, discussing the best routes to avoid unwanted attention from territorial marshals and cavalry patrols. That's when Tobias made his move. He stepped up behind Dalton and pressed the point of his knife against the man's ribs, just below the heart. The blade was thin enough to slide between ribs and into vital organs, and both men knew it. I'm going to make you a different offer, Tobias said quietly, his voice so low that only Dalton could hear him. You're going to walk away from this cage, and you're going to forget you ever saw this woman. In exchange, I'm going to let you keep breathing. Dalton went very still. He was a predator, but he was also a businessman, and he knew better than to argue with a man who had a knife pressed against his heart. You're making a mistake, half-breed. I've got protection in this territory, important friends. Maybe, Tobias agreed. But your friends aren't here right now. I am. For a long moment, the two men stood frozen while the crowd continued to celebrate around them. Then Dalton slowly raised his hands and stepped away from the cage. This isn't over, he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. Yes, it is, Tobias replied. He kept the knife visible as he turned to the auctioneer. I'll give you $25 for her. The auctioneer's eyes darted between Tobias and Dalton, clearly uncertain about the wisdom of crossing either man. But $25 was $25, and the survival instinct that had kept him alive in places like Bitter Creek told him that the half-breed was more immediately dangerous than the flesh peddler. $25 it is, he said quickly, Sold to, what's your name, mister? Tobias Stormwind. Sold to Tobias Stormwind for $25. The crowd's cheers died down as they realized what had happened. Dalton was backing away through the crowd, his face twisted with fury, but his hands carefully visible and empty. The auctioneer was fumbling with the keys to the cage, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock the heavy padlock. Tobias knelt beside the cage as the doors swung open, but he didn't reach for Kira. Instead, he set his knife on the ground between them and pushed it toward her. "My name is Tobias Stormwind," he said quietly, speaking in the Hidatsa language his grandmother had taught him. "I am the son of Sarah Stormwind and grandson of Walks with Thunder. I have bought your freedom, but I do not own you. The choice of what happens next is yours." Kira stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had never been truly broken. "Why?" "Because no one should be sold like an animal," Tobias replied. "Because my grandmother taught me that our people take care of each other, even when the world tries to make us forget who we are." Kira looked at the knife lying between them, then at the crowd of men who were still watching with hungry eyes. She reached out and picked up the blade, testing its weight and sharpness with the practiced movements of someone who understood weapons. "If I come with you," she said, "will you try to make me your woman?" "Only if you choose to be," Tobias answered. "I'm offering you protection and a chance to heal. Nothing more, nothing less." Kira studied his face for another long moment, then nodded slowly. She used the knife to cut the leather cords binding her wrists, wincing as the circulation returned to her hands. The iron shackles around her ankles would require different tools, but she was no longer helpless. "I accept your protection, Tobias Stormwind," she said formally. "But I keep this knife." "It's yours," he replied, then stood and offered her his hand. She looked at his outstretched palm, then at his face, then back at his hand. When she finally took it, her fingers were cold despite the heat, and he could feel the tremor that ran through her as she struggled to stand on legs that had been cramped in the cage for hours. The crowd was getting restless again, and Tobias could feel the mood shifting toward violence. These men had come expecting a show, and they were disappointed by the civilized conclusion to the auction. Some of them were already muttering about taking matters into their own hands. "We need to leave," Tobias said quietly. "Now," Kira nodded. But when she tried to take a step, her injured shoulder sent a wave of pain through her that made her gasp. Tobias caught her arm gently, steadying her without trying to control her movements. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can do whatever I need to do," she replied, but her voice was tight with pain. They made their way through the crowd, Tobias keeping one hand near his gun and the other ready to support Kira if she stumbled. The men parted before them, but not willingly. Tobias could feel their eyes on his back, could hear the whispered threats and crude suggestions that followed in their wake. Outside, the heat hit them like a physical blow, but it was clean heat, untainted by the stench of unwashed bodies and human misery. Tobias led Kira to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that he'd named Thunder for the way his hooves sounded on hard ground. "Can you mount?" he asked. Kira looked at the horse, then at the stirrup that hung nearly as high as her waist. With her injured shoulder and the shackles around her ankles, mounting would be a challenge. But she set her jaw and reached for the saddle horn. "Wait," Tobias said. He pulled a small crowbar from his saddlebags and knelt beside her feet. "These shackles will tear your skin raw if you try to ride with them on." The iron was crude but effective, designed more for security than comfort. Tobias wedged the crowbar between the shackle and her ankle, using his weight and leverage to force the metal apart. It took several minutes of careful work, but finally, the shackles fell away, leaving angry red marks on her skin. "Better?" he asked. Kira flexed her ankles, then nodded. Better. This time, when she reached for the saddle horn, she was able to pull herself up onto Thunder's back. It wasn't graceful, and Tobias could see the pain that shot through her shoulder, but she managed it without help. Tobias mounted behind her, careful not to crowd her or make her feel trapped. Thunder was a big horse, strong enough to carry two riders, and he stood steady as they settled into position. "Where are we going?" Kira asked. "Away from here," Tobias replied. "There's a cabin about 2 hours' ride north, near a stream. It's not much, but it's clean and it's safe. And then we figure out what comes next, together." As they rode away from Bitter Creek Trading Post, Tobias felt the weight of what he'd just done settling on his shoulders. He'd spent his life savings to buy a woman's freedom, made an enemy of one of the most dangerous men in the territory, and committed himself to protecting someone he barely knew. By any rational measure, it had been the act of a fool. But when he looked at the proud set of Kira's shoulders, at the way she sat straight in the saddle despite her injuries, at the defiant tilt of her chin as she faced the uncertain future ahead, he knew he'd made the right choice. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere behind them, dangerous men were making dangerous plans. Somewhere ahead, an uncertain future waited with all its promise and peril. But for now, in this moment, they were free. And sometimes Tobias thought that was enough. The cabin emerged from the twilight like a ghost materializing from the mist, its log walls weathered silver by countless seasons of rain and snow. Nestled in a grove of cottonwoods beside a creek that sang its way down from the mountain peaks, it was the kind of place that existed in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, belonging fully to neither. Tobias had built it 3 years ago with his own hands, cutting each log and chink in every gap, creating a sanctuary where he could retreat from a world that had never quite known what to do with him. Thunder's hooves splashed through the shallow ford, the sound of water against stone mixing with the evening chorus of crickets and night birds. Kira had not spoken during the 2-hour ride, but Tobias could feel the tension in her posture, the way she held herself ready for flight or fight despite her exhaustion. Trust, he knew, was not something that could be purchased for $25. It had to be earned one careful gesture at a time. "Easy, boy," Tobias murmured to Thunder as they approached the cabin. The horse had been sensing his rider's tension, ears swiveling constantly and nostrils flaring at every unfamiliar scent. But now on familiar ground, the gelding began to relax, his pace slowing to a comfortable walk. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone chimney that spoke of warm fires and a covered porch that promised shelter from the elements. A lean-to stable stood beside it, empty now but clearly maintained. Behind the cabin, Tobias had built a small corral where he kept his horses during the winter months. Everything spoke of a man who planned for the future, who understood that survival in this country required both strength and patience. Tobias dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He turned to help Kira down, but she was already sliding from the saddle, her movements careful but determined. The pain in her shoulder was clearly severe, but she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback. "The stable is secure," Tobias said, leading Thunder toward the lean-to. "No one will find us here tonight." Kira said nothing, but her eyes were taking in every detail of their surroundings. The placement of the cabin, the sight lines from the windows, the escape routes through the trees. She was thinking like a warrior, and Tobias found himself respecting her even more for it. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of pine logs and wood smoke. Tobias lit a kerosene lamp, and the golden light revealed a space that was Spartan, but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs positioned before it. A bed stood in one corner, neatly made with wool blankets and a buffalo robe. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and supplies. What caught Kira's attention, however, was the collection of artifacts that decorated the space. Eagle feathers hung from the rafters, their white tips catching the lamplight. A drum sat in one corner, its hide head painted with symbols that she recognized as Hidatsa. Beadwork decorated the windowsills, and a medicine bundle hung from a peg beside the door. "Your grandmother's work?" she asked, speaking for the first time since they'd left the trading post. Tobias nodded, following her gaze to the beadwork. "She died 2 winters ago. These are all I have left of her." Kira stepped closer to examine the intricate patterns, her fingers hovering just above the colored beads. "She was gifted. These patterns. They tell stories." "The story of our people," Tobias said quietly. "The story of who we were before the world changed." For a moment, they stood in silence, 2 people caught between worlds, finding common ground in the memory of an old woman's careful hands. Then Kira swayed slightly, and Tobias realized that exhaustion and pain were taking their toll. "You need food," he said, moving toward the shelves where he kept his supplies. "And that shoulder needs attention. I can tend to my own wounds." Kira said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm sure you can," Tobias replied, pulling down a jar of dried venison and a bag of cornmeal. "But you don't have to. Not anymore." He began preparing a simple meal, working with the efficient movements of a man who had long ago learned to cook for himself. The venison went into a pot with water and wild onions, while cornmeal was mixed with water and a pinch of salt to make flatbread. The familiar routine was soothing, a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, some things remained constant. Kira watched him work, her eyes tracking his every movement. "Why did you really buy me?" she asked suddenly. Tobias paused in his stirring, considering his answer. "Because I knew what would happen if I didn't." "That's not an answer, isn't it?" He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious. "I've seen what men like Dalton do to women like you. I've seen the broken shells they leave behind when they're finished. I couldn't let that happen, not when I had the power to stop it." Kira studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. "And you expect nothing in return?" "I expect you to heal," Tobias said simply. "I expect you to remember who you are, not who they tried to make you become. Everything else is your choice." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Kira had spent weeks as a captive, her agency stripped away, her choices reduced to compliance or punishment. The idea that she could simply choose her own path seemed almost too good to be true. "I don't know if I remember how to choose," she admitted, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Tobias nodded, understanding flooding his features. "Then we'll start small. Do you want to sit by the fire or at the table?" Such a simple question, but Kira felt tears prick at her eyes. When had she last been asked what she wanted? When had her preferences mattered to anyone? "The fire," she said, and was surprised by how good it felt to make even that small decision. Tobias helped her settle into one of the chairs, noting the way she favored her injured shoulder. The firelight played across her features, highlighting the bruises and cuts that marked her ordeal. But it also revealed the strength that lay beneath the damage, the unbroken spirit that had kept her alive through the worst of it. "I need to look at that shoulder," he said gently. "I think it's dislocated." Kira tensed, her hand instinctively moving to protect the injured area. "I said I could tend to my own wounds." "And I said you don't have to," Tobias replied. "But I won't touch you without your permission. That's a promise." The sincerity in his voice made something tight in Kira's chest begin to loosen. She had grown so accustomed to men taking what they wanted without asking that the simple act of seeking her consent felt revolutionary. "You know healing?" she asked. "My grandmother taught me. She was a medicine woman among our people before the treaties forced us onto the reservation. She said the old ways shouldn't die just because the world had changed." Kira considered this, weighing her options. Her shoulder was in agony, and she knew from experience that a dislocated joint would only get worse if left untreated. But allowing someone to touch her, to have power over her body, felt like an impossible leap of faith. "If I say stop," she said finally, "you stop, immediately." "Immediately," Tobias agreed. With careful movements, he approached her chair, his hands visible and his movements slow and deliberate. Kira watched him like a trapped animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. But Tobias moved with the patient grace of a man who understood trauma, who knew that trust was a fragile thing that could be shattered by a single wrong move. "I'm going to touch your shoulder now," he said softly, "just to feel the bones, to understand what's wrong." His fingers were gentle as they probed the injured area, and Kira found herself surprised by the clinical detachment with which he worked. This wasn't the rough grabbing she had endured from her captors. This was the careful touch of a healer, someone who understood the difference between causing pain and relieving it. "It's definitely dislocated," he said after a moment. "The head of the bone has slipped out of the socket. I can put it back, but it's going to hurt." "How much?" Kira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "A lot, but only for a moment. Then the relief will be significant." Kira closed her eyes, weighing her options. She could continue to live with the constant ache, the limited mobility, the way the injury made her vulnerable. Or she could trust this man, this stranger who had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect. "Do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tobias positioned himself carefully, one hand on her shoulder, the other on her upper arm. On the count of 3. 1.2. He moved on 2, a quick, decisive motion that popped the joint back into place with an audible click. Kira's sharp intake of breath was the only sound she made, though Tobias could see the way her whole body tensed against the pain. Then, as he had promised, the relief came. The constant ache that had plagued her for weeks simply vanished, replaced by a looseness in the joint that felt like a miracle. Kira flexed her arm experimentally, marveling at the return of her full range of motion. "Better?" Tobias asked. "Much better," she admitted, surprise coloring her voice. "The muscles will be sore for a few days," he warned. "But the joint should heal cleanly now." He returned to his cooking, giving her space to process what had just happened. The simple act of healing, of having someone tend to her injuries without expectation or demand, was almost overwhelming. Kira found herself studying this man who had turned her world upside down in the space of a few hours. Tobias Stormwind was not what she would have expected from a half-blood living on the frontier. He moved with quiet confidence, spoke with careful consideration, and seemed to possess a core of strength that was both gentle and implacable. His mixed heritage was evident in his features, but he wore it without shame or apology. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said as he ladled stew into a wooden bowl. Tobias smiled, the expression transforming his normally serious features. Walks with Thunder was formidable. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but she could stare down a grizzly bear. "She was the one who taught me the old ways, the old languages. She said that just because the world wanted to forget, our people didn't mean we had to forget ourselves. She sounds like a wise woman." She was. "She's also the one who taught me that strength isn't about how much you can take, but about how much you can give." She would have liked you, I think. Kira accepted the bowl of stew, inhaling the rich aroma of venison and wild herbs. "How can you be sure?" "Because she always said that the strongest people were the ones who could survive being broken without losing themselves in the process. And you you're still here. Still fighting, still choosing to trust, even when trust seems impossible." The words hit Kira like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had survived things that would have destroyed a weaker person, and she had done it without losing the essential core of who she was. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. Strength isn't something you feel, Tobias said, settling into his own. Share with a bowl of stew. It's something you do. And you've been doing it every day since they took you from your people. They ate in comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the creek providing a peaceful backdrop to their meal. Kira found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. The combination of food, warmth, and safety working to unknot the tension that had become her constant companion. What happens now? She asked when they had finished eating. Now you rest. Tobias said, tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. And if I choose to leave, then I'll help you get wherever you want to go. And if I choose to stay, Tobias met her eyes, his expression serious. Then you'll stay as my guest, my ally, my friend. But never as my property, that paper the auctioneer gave me. It's all ready. Burning in the fire. Shira looked toward the fireplace and saw the charred remains of what had once been a bill of sale. The document that had supposedly transferred ownership of her from one man to another was now nothing but ash and smoke. You really don't expect anything from me, she said, wonder in her voice. I expect you to be who you are, Tobias replied. Kira Moonhawk, daughter of the Hidatsa, skilled in the healing arts and the training of horses. I expect you to remember that you are more than what they tried to make you become. For the first time since her capture, Kira felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. It was fragile, tentative, like a flame that might be extinguished by the slightest breeze. But it was there, and it was hers. I would like to stay, she said quietly. At least for a while. Tobias nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. Then you're welcome here for as long as you need. As the evening wore on, they talked quietly. By the fire, sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, their experiences in a world that seemed determined to erase their heritage. Kira found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. Drawn by Tobias's quiet strength and genuine interest in her words. When exhaustion finally claimed her, Tobias made up a bed for himself on the floor, insisting that she take the proper bed. Kira wanted to protest, but the thought of sleeping in a real bed, safe and warm, was too tempting to resist. As she settled beneath the wool blankets, listening to the sound of Tobias moving quietly about the cabin, extinguishing the lamp, and banking the fire, Kira felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. For the first time since her capture, she was not afraid of what the morning might bring. Outside, the night sounds of the wilderness continued their ancient symphony. But inside the cabin, two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances began the delicate process of building something new. Not love, not yet, but something that might become love given time and trust. And in the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire, the future seemed full of possibilities that neither of them had dared to imagine just hours before. 3 weeks had passed since the night Kira Moonhawk first slept safely in Tobias Stormwind's cabin, and the mountain meadow had become a place of transformation. Where once there had been only the careful distance of strangers bound by circumstance, now there existed something deeper, more complex. Not love exactly, but a partnership forged in the quiet moments between dawn and dusk, in the sharing of daily tasks and the gradual rebuilding of trust. Kira knelt by the creek in the early morning light, her reflection wavering in the clear water, as she worked to tan a deer hide that Tobias had brought back from yesterday's hunt. Her shoulder had healed completely, the range of motion restored, but more importantly, her spirit had begun to mend as well. The constant vigilance that had marked her first days here had softened into something more sustainable, a watchfulness that no longer consumed her every waking moment. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up, her hands stilling on the hide. Tobias emerged from the tree line, astride Thunder, but his usual easy posture was replaced by tension that spoke of trouble. Behind him, tied to his saddle, was a second horse, a Baymari that Kira didn't recognize. Company coming, he said without preamble as he dismounted. 3 riders, maybe 4 hours behind me. They've been tracking us. Kira rose smoothly to her feet, her mind already shifting into the survival mode that had kept her alive during her captivity. Dalton, and 2 others. Professional trackers, by the look of their signs. They've been following our trail since yesterday morning. The news hit Kira like a physical blow, but she didn't allow herself to show it. She had known this moment would come eventually. Men like Dalton didn't forget about property they considered stolen, and they certainly didn't forgive the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by a half-blood tracker. How much time do we have? She asked, already moving toward the cabin. 4 hours, maybe 5 if they stop to rest their horses. But Kira ... Tobias caught her arm gently as she passed. You don't have to run. This is my fight now. She turned to face him, seeing the determination in his gray eyes and the set of his jaw. In the weeks they had spent together, she had come to recognize the signs of Tobias preparing for battle. The way his movements became more economical. The way his voice grew quieter and more focused. He was a man who had learned to fight for what mattered, and somehow, she had become something that mattered to him. No, she said firmly. This is our fight. They're coming for both of us now. Tobias nodded, having expected no other answer. In the time they had spent together, he had learned that Kira Moonhawk was not a woman who ran from trouble. She was a woman who faced it head-on, with courage and intelligence and a fierce determination that had impressed him from the very beginning. The Bay Mari is for you, he said, gesturing toward the horse he had brought back. She's fast and sure-footed. I traded for her at the Mackenzie Ranch this morning. Kira examined Mare with a practiced eye, noting the good lines and the alert intelligence in the animal's gaze. She's beautiful, but if you bought her for me to escape ... I bought her so you'd have choices, Tobias interrupted. Stay and fight, or ride away and start over somewhere else. Both options require a good horse. The distinction was important, and Kira understood it. Once again, Tobias was offering her agency, the power to choose her own path. It was a gift that never stopped surprising her, even after 3 weeks of his consistent respect for her autonomy. I choose to stay, she said without hesitation. Then we'd better get ready. They spent the next hour preparing for battle with the methodical efficiency of people who had learned that survival often depended on attention to detail. Tobias cleaned and loaded his weapons, a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver that he wore in a well-oiled holster. Kira sharpened her knife and fashioned a sling from leather strips, a weapon she had learned to use with deadly accuracy as a child. But their preparations went beyond weapons. They cached supplies in the forest, created escape routes through the trees, and established signals that would allow them to communicate without words. Most importantly, they talked through scenarios, planning their responses to different approaches their enemies might take. Dalton's not stupid, Tobias said as they worked. He knows I'm armed and dangerous. He'll try to use you against me. How? Threats, promises of what he'll do to you if I don't surrender. He'll try to make me believe that cooperation is your only chance of survival. Kira's jaw tightened. And if he tries to take me, then he'll learn that some mistakes are fatal. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. Kira had no doubt that Tobias would keep that promise, just as she had no doubt that she would fight to her last breath, before allowing herself to be taken alive. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they took positions that would give them the best advantage. Tobias positioned himself in the loft of the cabin, where he could command a view of the entire clearing. Kira concealed herself in the trees near the creek, where she could move unseen and strike from an unexpected angle. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched like hours as they listened for the sound of approaching horses, for the snap of a twig, or the whisper of voices that would announce their enemy's arrival. Kira found herself thinking about the past 3 weeks, about the gradual transformation that had taken place in this peaceful meadow. She thought about the morning when she had woken to find Tobias teaching a young deer to eat from his hand. His patience and gentleness with the wild creature, revealing depths of character that had surprised her. She thought about the evening when they had sat by the fire sharing stories of their childhoods, when she had learned that his mixed heritage had made him an outsider in both worlds, accepted fully by neither. Most of all, she thought about the gradual way that her fear had transformed into something else. Not just trust, though that had certainly grown, but a kind of partnership that she had never experienced before. Tobias had never tried to control her, never assumed that his protection gave him ownership of her choices. Instead, he had consistently treated her as an equal, someone whose opinions mattered, and whose autonomy was sacred. The sound of horses entering the clearing broke through her reverie. 3 riders, as Tobias had predicted, moving with the confident swagger of men who believed they held all the advantages. Dalton rode in the center, his black suit replaced by practical traveling clothes, but his pale, calculating eyes unchanged. The 2 men flanking him were clearly professionals, their movements coordinated and their weapons ready. "Stormwind," Dalton called out, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "We know you're here. Come out and let's discuss this like civilized men." Silence greeted his words, broken only by the sound of water flowing over rocks and the whisper of wind through the trees. "I'm prepared to be reasonable," Dalton continued. "You return my property, and I'll consider the matter closed. No hard feelings, no pursuit. You can go back to your hunting and tracking, and we'll forget this unfortunate misunderstanding ever happened." From her position in the trees, Kira could see the way the 2 trackers were positioned, their eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding forest. They were good, she realized. They had dismounted and taken cover without her noticing. And they were communicating with hand signals that spoke of military training. "I know you can hear me, Stormwind," Dalton called out again. "And I know she's here too. Kira Moonhawk, isn't it? Pretty name for a pretty woman. I've been looking forward to getting better acquainted." The words were designed to provoke, to make Tobias reveal himself through anger or protectiveness. But Kira could see him in the cabin loft, perfectly still and patient, waiting for the right moment to act. "You know what I find interesting?" Dalton continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone. "I've been asking around about you, Stormwind. Half-breed tracker, works alone, no family, no ties. The kind of man who could disappear tomorrow. And no one would notice or care." One of the trackers had begun moving toward the cabin, using the trees for cover. Kira shifted her position, moving silently through the undergrowth to intercept him. "But the woman," Dalton went on, "she's different. She's got people who care about her, people who are looking for her. Her brother, for instance. Fine young warrior named Joseph Moonhawk. He's been offering quite a reward for information about his sister's whereabouts." Kira's blood ran cold. Joseph was indeed her brother, younger by 2 years, and fierce in his protection of family. If Dalton had found him, if he was using Joseph as leverage. "That's right," Dalton said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "I can see I have your attention now. Your brother is currently my guest, safe and sound for now. But his continued well-being depends on your cooperation." The tracker was almost to the cabin now, his rifle ready and his eyes focused on the fire door. Kira drew her knife and prepared to strike, but before she could move, Tobias's voice rang out from the loft. "That's close enough." The tracker froze, his head snapping up toward the sound. In the same instant, Tobias's rifle cracked, and the man's weapon spun from his hands, the bullet having struck the barrel with surgical precision. "Next shot won't be a warning," Tobias said calmly. The clearing erupted into chaos. The second tracker opened fire on the cabin, his bullet splintering the logs around the loft window. Dalton drew his pistol and began moving toward the trees where he suspected Kira was hiding. But Kira was no longer where he expected her to be. She had used the distraction to circle around behind him, moving with the silent grace of a hunter. When she struck, it was with the swift efficiency of a predator, her knife finding the soft spot between his ribs before he even knew she was there. Dalton gasped and stumbled, his pistol falling from nerveless fingers. He turned to face her, his pale eyes wide with shock and pain. "You made a mistake," Kira said quietly. "You assumed I was still the broken woman you saw in that cage. But I'm not. I'm Kira Moonhawk, daughter of the Hidatsa, and I don't break." "Your brother," Dalton wheezed, blood staining his lips. "He's still ... My brother is a warrior," Kira interrupted. "He can take care of himself, just like I can." Dalton's eyes widened as he realized his mistake. The story about Joseph had been a lie, a desperate attempt to gain leverage over her. But Kira had seen through it, had recognized the desperation behind his words. "You never had him," she said, understanding flooding her voice. "You were gambling that I would believe you, that I would surrender to save someone who was never in danger." Dalton tried to speak, but the strength was leaving his body. He slumped to the ground, his hand pressed to the wound in his side. Sound of gunfire from the cabin had stopped, and Tobias's voice rang out across the clearing. "Kira, you all right?" "I'm fine," she called back. "Dalton's down. So are his friends." "It's over." Kira knelt beside the dying man, her knife still in her hand but her expression calm. "You want to know the difference between you and him?" she said quietly. "You saw property where he saw a person. You saw weakness where he saw strength. You saw something to be owned where he saw someone to be respected." Dalton's eyes were growing glassy, but he managed one last whisper. "Should have ... taken the money ... Yes," Kira agreed. "You should have." When Tobias emerged from the cabin a few minutes later, he found Kira sitting by the creek, washing the blood from her hands. Her face was calm, but he could see the slight tremor in her fingers that spoke of adrenaline and reaction. "You did what you had to do," he said gently, settling beside her on the bank. "I know," she replied, "but it doesn't make it easier." They sat in silence for a while, watching the water flow past and listening to the sounds of the forest returning to normal. The violence was over, but its echoes would linger for a long time. "What happens now?" Kira asked finally. "Now we bury the dead and move on," Tobias said. "The law won't come looking for men like Dalton. They'll be marked down as missing, presumed dead in the wilderness. And us? That depends on what you want." Kira considered this, thinking about the choices that lay before her. She could return to her people, try to rebuild the life that had been shattered by her captivity. She could strike out on her own, forge a new path in the vast wilderness of the American frontier. Or she could stay here, with this man who had given her back her life and asked for nothing in return. "I want to stay," she said finally. "Not as your guest, not as someone you're protecting, but as your partner." Tobias smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. "Partners then, in everything." "In everything," she agreed as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Kira Moonhawk and Tobias Stormwind sat by the creek that had become their sanctuary. They had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, their bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. They had found something rare in the wilderness, something that couldn't be bought or sold or stolen away. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found themselves. Mountains stood eternal and unchanging around them, but within their embrace, two people had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a journey to somewhere new, but with the decision to stay and build something lasting in the place. Where you found your home. Winter came early to the high country that year, arriving with a fury that transformed the peaceful meadow into a crystalline wilderness of snow and ice. The first blizzard struck just 2 weeks after the confrontation with Dalton, as if the mountains themselves were drawing a curtain across the violent events of autumn. Inside the cabin, Kira and Tobias settled into a rhythm that was both intimate and respectful. Two people learning to share space and purpose in the enforced closeness of a frontier winter. The morning light filtered through windows, frosted with ice crystals, casting diamond patterns across the rough-hewn walls. Kira stood at the kitchen table, her hands working with practiced precision as she prepared traditional Hidatsa medicines from herbs she had gathered before the snows came. The scent of sage and sweetgrass filled the air, mixing with the smell of wood smoke and the coffee that Tobias had brewing on the stove. "The Hendersons will be grateful for these," she said, carefully measuring powdered willow bark into small cloth pouches. "Mrs. Henderson's arthritis has been troubling her something fierce." Tobias nodded, pulling on his heavy coat in preparation for the ride to the neighboring ranch. Over the past month, word had spread through the scattered community about Kira's healing skills, and people had begun making the difficult journey through the snow to seek her help. What had started as simple courtesy had evolved into something more significant, a medical practice that served families within a day's hard ride of their cabin. "Doc Williams rode up from Billings last week," Tobias said, checking his saddlebags. "He was asking about you again." Kira's hands stilled for a moment. Dr. Williams was the territorial physician, a man whose medical degree from Harvard carried weight even in the wilderness. He had visited twice now, ostensibly to check on patients, but really to observe Kira's methods and question her about her knowledge of traditional healing. What did he want to know this time? Same things as before. How you set broken bones without splints. How you treat pneumonia with plant medicines. How you know which herbs to use for which ailments. He's not challenging your methods, Kira. He's trying to learn from them. This was the part that still amazed Kira. In the world she had known before her captivity, white doctors had dismissed traditional healing as superstition and ignorance. But Dr. Williams approached her knowledge with genuine respect, even going so far as to take notes on her techniques and ask if she would consider training some of the settlement women in basic medical care. He mentioned something else, Tobias continued, his voice carefully neutral, about a teaching position at the new territorial hospital in Helena. They're looking for someone to establish a program in traditional medicine to work alongside the regular physicians. Kira set down her measuring spoon and turned to face him. "A teaching position? Full salary, housing provided, access to medical supplies and equipment. It would be a chance to reach more people, to preserve the old knowledge, while learning new techniques." The offer was extraordinary, the kind of opportunity that rarely came to women of any background, let alone a Hidatsa woman who had been sold at auction just months before. But Kira could hear the careful restraint in Tobias's voice, the way he was presenting the information without advocating for any particular choice. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. "I think you should do whatever makes you happiest," he replied. "But I also think you should know that you've already changed things here. The way people see our people, the way they think about traditional knowledge. Mrs. Patterson told me yesterday that she's been teaching her daughter some of the plant lore you shared with her." Kira felt a warm flutter in her chest at the thought. Mary Patterson was the wife of a local rancher, a woman who had initially been suspicious of Kira's presence in the community. But when her youngest son had fallen ill with a fever that the traveling doctor couldn't break, she had swallowed her pride and asked for help. Kira's treatment had saved the boy's life, and Mary had become one of her most vocal supporters. "There's something else," Tobias said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Something I need to tell you before you make any decisions about the future." Kira could sense the shift in his mood, the way his easy confidence was replaced by something more uncertain. What is it? I've been offered a position too. Head tracker for the Territorial Marshal's Office. Based in Helena, like the hospital. Good pay, steady work. A chance to use my skills for law enforcement instead of hunting bounties. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Both of them had been offered opportunities that would take them to Helena, to new lives and new possibilities. But neither had spoken of whether those new lives would include each other. When did you find out about this? Kira asked. 3 days ago, Marshal Davis rode out with the offer. He's been tracking my work for months, said he was impressed by how I handled the situation with Dalton and his men. Kira turned back to her medicine making, but her hands were no longer steady. In the months since her rescue, she had grown accustomed to the assumption that she and Tobias were building something together. But now, faced with the reality of separate opportunities and separate futures, she realized how much she had been taking for granted. These are good opportunities, she said carefully. For both of us, they are, Tobias agreed. But Kira, I need you to know something. I didn't accept the marshal's offer. She turned to face him, surprised. Why not? Because I don't want to leave this place. Not the cabin, not the mountains, but this life we've built together. I've spent years moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. But here, with you, I've found something I didn't know I was looking for. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of absolute sincerity. Kira felt her heart begin to race, not from fear this time, but from something else entirely. What are you saying, Tobias? I'm saying that I love you, Kira Moonhawk. Not as a rescuer loves someone he saved, not as a protector loves someone he's shielding from harm. I love you as a man loves a woman he wants to spend his life with. And if you'll have me, I want to ask you to be my wife. The proposal was simple, direct, and completely honest. No elaborate gestures or flowery speeches, just the truth spoken plainly by a man who had learned that honesty was the foundation of any relationship worth having. Kira felt tears prick at her eyes, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. In the months since her rescue, she had slowly rebuilt her sense of self, her confidence in her own worth and abilities. But she had also discovered something else, something that had grown so gradually she had barely noticed it until this moment. I love you too, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid that you might think it was gratitude rather than genuine feeling. Tobias crossed the small space between them and took her hands in his. And now I know the difference, she said, smiling through her tears. Yes, Tobias Stormwind. I will marry you. The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative at first, then deeper and more passionate as they allowed themselves to fully express the feelings they had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and their faces were flushed with emotion. So what do we do about Helena? Kira asked, her practical nature reasserting itself even in the midst of romantic joy. We go, Tobias said simply. Together, we take both positions and we build a life there. You can teach and heal. I can track and serve the law. We can be partners in everything, just like we planned. You do that? Leave this place? Kira, this place is beautiful, but it's not what makes it home. You are. Wherever you go, that's where I want to be. She studied his face, seeing the absolute certainty in his eyes. But what about your grandmother's things, your cabin, everything you've built here? The important things we'll take with us. The rest ... he shrugged. They're just objects. What matters is that we're together. They spent the rest of the morning making plans, discussing the logistics of their new life and the timing of their wedding. They decided to marry before leaving for Helena, to start their new life as husband and wife, rather than as two people who happened to be traveling together. The ceremony took place 3 weeks later, On a crystalline December morning when the snow lay thick and clean across the meadow, there was no minister available but old Jake Morrison, the justice of the peace from the nearest settlement, made the difficult journey through the snow to perform the ceremony. The guest list was small but heartfelt, including Dr. Williams, the Patterson family, and several other families who had come to know and respect Kira's work. Kira wore a dress of white doeskin that she had made herself, decorated with beadwork that told the story of her journey from captivity to freedom to love. Tobias wore his best suit, but he had braided his hair with the silver ornaments that had belonged to his grandmother, honoring both sides of his heritage. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound. Promises to support each other's dreams, to face whatever challenges might come as equal partners, and to honor the love that had grown between them in the shadow of adversity. I promise to see you as you are, not as the world has tried to make you, Tobias said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. To respect your choices, to support your dreams, and to stand beside you in all things. I promise to trust you with my heart, my future, and my dreams, Kira replied. To be your partner in adventure and in peace, in sorrow and in joy, for all the days of our lives. When Jake Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. But for Kira and Tobias, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, to the promise they had made and the future they would build together. The wedding feast was simple but joyful, with food contributed by all the families in attendance. There was venison stew and fresh bread, wild berry preserves and honey cakes, and a fiddle player who had traveled from the Patterson Ranch to provide music for Dancing Dot. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Kira found herself standing on the porch of the cabin, looking out over the snow-covered meadow that had been her refuge and her healing place. Tomorrow they would begin packing for the journey to Helena, to new lives and new opportunities. But tonight, she wanted to remember this place and this moment, when she had truly understood what it meant to be free. Regrets? Tobias asked, joining her on the porch. None, she said, taking his hand. Only gratitude. For what? For the chance to choose my own path. For the opportunity to use my skills to help others. For finding love when I thought I had lost everything. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And for finding a man who saw a person where others saw property. Tobias pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as they stood together in the cold night air. We're going to do great things in Helena, he said softly. Together. Together, she agreed. And in that single word was all the promise of their future. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant but somehow comforting in their eternal dance. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, and another answered, their voices carrying across the wilderness like a blessing. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and bright, but outside, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances stood together and faced the future without fear. They had been tested by tragedy and emerged stronger. They had faced violence and chosen peace. They had been offered the chance to build something new and beautiful, and they had seized it with both hands. The mountains stood eternal around them, but within their embrace, Kira and Tobias had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a journey to somewhere new, but with the decision to journey there together, as partners in all things, for all the days of their lives. 5 years had passed since Kira and Tobias Stormwind first arrived in Helena, Montana Territory, and the bustling territorial capital had become a place of remarkable transformation. The Helena Territorial Hospital stood as a testament to progress, its red brick walls housing not only the most advanced medical equipment available west of the Mississippi, but also the nation's first official department of traditional medicine, where indigenous healing practices were studied, documented, and integrated with modern medical techniques. The spring morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kira's office, illuminating the carefully organized shelves that lined the walls. Dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the ceiling, their earthy scents mixing with the antiseptic smell of the modern hospital ward just beyond her door. Medical texts in English sat alongside handwritten journals in Hidatsa, documenting healing practices that had been passed down through generations, but had never before been formally recorded. Kira stood at her desk, reviewing the correspondence that had arrived on the morning train from Washington. The letter bore the official seal of the Smithsonian Institution, and its contents had the power to change everything she had worked to build. Dr. Samuel Langley, the secretary of the Smithsonian, was requesting her participation in a groundbreaking study of indigenous medical practices across the American frontier. The project would involve traveling to reservations and settlements throughout the West, documenting traditional healing methods, and training a new generation of physicians in the integration of ancient wisdom with modern medicine. The Department of the Interior has approved funding for a comprehensive 5-year study, she read aloud to herself, her voice filled with wonder. The position would carry the title of senior ethnobotanist and would represent the first time a Native American woman has held such a position within the federal government. The opportunity was extraordinary, the kind of recognition that could elevate traditional healing from the realm of folk practice to legitimate medical science. But it would also mean leaving Helena, leaving the hospital and the community they had built, leaving the life they had created together. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Dr. Williams entering with his usual purposeful stride. In the 5 years since their first meeting, the Harvard-trained physician had become not just a colleague, but a genuine friend, someone who had championed her work even when other members of the medical establishment had questioned the wisdom of integrating traditional practices with modern medicine. "The surgical patient from yesterday is asking for you," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Mrs. Chun, she says the pain medication isn't working as well as the tea you prepared for her." Kira smiled, making a note to visit. The patient later, willow bark and meadowsweet. They work differently than morphine, but they're often more effective for certain types of pain, which is exactly why this hospital has the lowest patient mortality rate in the territory, Dr. Williams said with satisfaction. "Your integration of traditional remedies with surgical procedures has saved more lives than I can count." He paused, noticing the letter on her desk. "Good news or bad news?" "I'm not sure yet," Kira admitted, handing him the letter. "Read it and tell me what you think." Dr. Williams read in silence, his eyebrows rising steadily as he absorbed the contents. "When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Kira, this is extraordinary. The Smithsonian, federal funding, a chance to document and preserve traditional healing practices across the entire continent. It's the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. But," she prompted, sensing his hesitation, "but it would mean leaving everything you've built here. The hospital, your patients, your students. This department exists because of your vision and your dedication. Without you, the department would continue," Kira said firmly. "Dr. Standing Bear is ready to take over as department head. She's been my assistant for 3 years, and she understands both the traditional practices and the modern medical applications." Dr. Williams nodded slowly. "And Tobias? What does he think about this?" "I haven't told him yet," Kira admitted. "But I know what he'll say. He'll tell me to follow my dreams, to take the opportunity regardless of what it means for his own career. And you don't want to disrupt his work with the marshal's office. He's built something important here too," Kira said. "The territorial marshal service has never had a Native American deputy, let alone one who's been as effective as Tobias. He's changed the way law enforcement works in this territory, brought a different perspective to conflict resolution." Dr. Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "You know, I've watched you two for 5 years now. I've seen how you support each other's work, how you celebrate each other's successes, but I've also noticed something else. What's that? You both have a tendency to sacrifice your own opportunities for the sake of the other's happiness. It's admirable, but it's also potentially limiting. Kira considered this, recognizing the truth in his observation. So what do you think we should do? I think you should talk to your husband, Dr. William said simply. And I think you should trust that 5 years of marriage has taught you how to make decisions together. An hour later, Kira found Tobias in the marshal's office, studying a map of the territory that was marked with colored pins, indicating various criminal activities and law enforcement responses. He had grown into his role as deputy marshal with a skill that had surprised even him, bringing a combination of tracking expertise and cultural sensitivity that had made him invaluable in dealing with conflicts between settlers and Native American communities. How's the Richardson case coming along? She asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. Making progress, he replied, not looking up from the map. The missing cattle were definitely rustled, and I found tracks leading toward the Crow Reservation. But before I go charging in with accusations, I want to make sure I understand the full situation. This was typical of Tobias's approach to law enforcement, where other deputies might have immediately assumed guilt and moved in with force. He took the time to investigate thoroughly, to understand the cultural and economic factors that might be contributing to the crime. What if it's not rustling? Kira asked. What if it's something else? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Tobias said, finally looking up from the map. There's been a drought on the reservation, and the cattle might have wandered onto tribal land looking for water. If that's the case, then the theft might actually be the tribe trying to return the animals to their rightful owners. And if it is actual rustling, then I'll handle it with the appropriate tribal authorities, according to the treaties and the law. But I won't assume guilt based on prejudice. Kira smiled, proud of the man her husband had become. You know, I got an interesting letter today. She pulled out the Smithsonian correspondence and handed it to him. Tobias read it with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, his expression growing more thoughtful with each paragraph. This is incredible, Kira, he said when he finished. The Smithsonian, a federal position, a chance to document traditional healing practices across the entire frontier. It's everything you've been working toward. But it would mean leaving Helena, leaving the hospital, leaving your work with the marshal's office. Tobias set the letter down and took her hands in his. Kira, do you remember what I told you the day I proposed? You said you loved me and wanted to spend your life with me. I also said that wherever you go, that's where I want to be. I meant it then, and I mean it now. But your work here is important too, Kira protested. You've changed the way law enforcement works in this territory. You've prevented conflicts that could have escalated into violence. And that work will continue, Tobias said. But Kira, this opportunity, it's not just about your career. It's about preserving knowledge that could be lost forever. It's about ensuring that future generations have access to healing practices that have been proven effective over centuries. You really think I should accept? I think you should accept. And I think I should come with you. Kira stared at him. What about your position here? Marshal Davis and I have been talking about expanding the territorial marshal service to include traveling deputies, lawmen who can work across reservation boundaries and help resolve conflicts between different communities. It would be perfect for this kind of assignment. You've already thought this through, Kira said, realizing that her husband had been considering the possibilities even before she had shown him the letter. I've been thinking about it for months, Tobias admitted. Ever since Dr. Williams mentioned that the Smithsonian was interested in your work, I knew an opportunity like this would come eventually, and I wanted to be ready. So you'd give up your position here? I'd trade it for something better. A chance to work with you, to support your research while doing my own work in conflict resolution. We'd be partners in everything, just like we always planned. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Within a week, Kira had accepted the Smithsonian position, and Tobias had negotiated a special assignment with the Territorial Marshal Service that would allow him to accompany her on her research expeditions. The farewell ceremony at the hospital was both joyful and bittersweet. Kira's students presented her with a hand-bound journal to record her findings, while her patients brought gifts of beadwork and pottery that represented their gratitude for her care. "You've shown us that healing is not just about medicine," Dr. William said in his farewell speech. "It's about understanding people, respecting their traditions, and finding ways to bridge the gap between old wisdom and new knowledge." Dr. Standing Bear, who would be taking over the Department of Traditional Medicine, spoke last. "My teacher has shown me that our healing ways are not relics of the past, but live-in knowledge that can help heal the world. I promise to continue her work with the same dedication and respect she has shown." As summer turned to autumn, Kira and Tobias began their new life as traveling researchers and law enforcement officers. Their first assignment took them to the Blackfeet Reservation in northern Montana, where Kira documented traditional treatments for respiratory ailments while Tobias helped resolve a boundary dispute that had been threatening to escalate into violence. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Each reservation they visited, each community they studied, added to the growing body of knowledge that would eventually be published as the comprehensive Handbook of Indigenous Medical Practices that would become the standard reference for physicians throughout the American West. But perhaps more importantly, their work began to change attitudes. As word spread about their research, about the effectiveness of traditional healing methods, and the importance of cultural sensitivity in law enforcement, other territories began to implement similar programs. 3 years into their new assignment, Kira stood on a hill overlooking the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, watching the sun set over the endless prairie. In her satchel were detailed notes on the treatment of diabetes using traditional plant medicines, research that would eventually lead to the development of more effective treatments for the disease. Tobias joined her on the hill, his own day's work complete. He had successfully mediated a dispute between tribal police and federal agents, preventing what could have been a violent confrontation. "Any regrets?" he asked, the same question he had asked her on their wedding night 5 years before. "None," she said, taking his hand. "Only gratitude." "For what?" "For the chance to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. For the opportunity to show that traditional healing and modern medicine can work together. For finding a partner who supports my dreams, even when they take us far from home." "We've done good work," Tobias said, looking out over the reservation. "Important work." "We have," Kira agreed, "but I think we're just getting started." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Kira Moonhawk Stormwind reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a cage at a frontier auction to a position of respect and authority in the federal government. From a woman with no choices to someone whose work was changing the way an entire nation thought about healing and justice. The path had been long and often difficult, marked by violence and loss, by challenges that had tested her strength and her resolve. But it had also been marked by love, by the discovery of a partnership that had made everything else possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities to visit, new knowledge to preserve and share. But tonight, standing on a hill, with the man who had given her back her life and then chosen to share his own with her, Kira felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and meaning. The wind carried the scent of sage and sweetgrass across the prairie, the same plants that had been used by her people for generations to heal and to bless. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the vast landscape, a sound that spoke of progress and change and the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Kira smiled, knowing that whatever the future held, she would face it as she had faced everything. else in her new life, with courage, with dignity, and with the unwavering support of the man who had seen her not as property to be owned, but as a person to be respected, loved, and cherished for all the days of their lives. 10 years had passed since Kira Moonhawk Stormwind first stood in that auction cage at Bitter Creek Trading Post, and the autumn of 1886 found her in a place she had never imagined she would see again. The Hidatsa Reservation in North Dakota stretched before her like a landscape of memories, the rolling hills and winding rivers exactly as she remembered them from her childhood, yet somehow transformed by the weight of everything that had happened since. The train that had brought her and Tobias from their latest research expedition in Arizona pulled away from the small depot with a mournful whistle, leaving behind only dust and the lingering scent of coal smoke. Around them, the familiar sounds of her people's language filled the air, mixing with the autumn wind that carried the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of children playing. "It's been 15 years, Kira said softly, her voice carrying the weight of all the time that had passed since she had last walked on this soil. I wasn't sure I'd ever see this place again." Tobias stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. In the decade since they had begun their traveling research, his hair had begun to show threads of silver, and his face carried the lines that came from years of hard work and sun exposure. But his eyes were the same steady gray that had looked at her with such compassion in that auction house, and his presence was still the anchor that kept her grounded. "Your brother will be here soon," he said, checking his pocket watch. "The message said he'd meet us at the agency office." Joseph Moonhawk had grown into a man of considerable influence among the Hidatsa people, serving as both a traditional leader and a liaison with the federal government. His letters over the years had painted a picture of a community struggling to maintain its identity while adapting to the realities of reservation life, a delicate balance that required both strength and wisdom. They made their way through the small settlement that had grown up around the agency headquarters, past houses that mixed traditional construction with government-issued materials, past gardens where corn and beans grew alongside vegetables introduced by white settlers. It was a place caught between worlds, much like Kira herself had been for so many years. The agency office was a simple wooden building with a covered porch, and as they approached, a tall man emerged from the shadows. Joseph had his sisters, high cheekbones and proud bearing, but his face was weathered by years of responsibility, and his eyes held the weariness of someone who had fought many battles, both political and personal. "Kira," he said simply, and then she was in his arms, both of them crying tears that had been held back for too many years. "Joseph," she whispered against his shoulder, "I thought I might never see you again." "I knew you would come back," he said, holding her at arm's length to study her face. "I knew that someday you would come home." They talked long into the night in Joseph's house, a comfortable dwelling that reflected his position as both a traditional leader and a progressive voice within the community. His wife, Sarah, prepared a feast that included traditional foods alongside dishes that had been adapted from white settlers' recipes, another example of the cultural blending that had become necessary for survival. "Tell me about your work," Joseph said as they sat around the fire after dinner. "Your letters have been full of stories, but I want to hear it from your own voice." Kira shared the story of the past 10 years, of the research expeditions that had taken her to dozens of reservations across the American West, of the medical knowledge she had documented and the healing practices she had helped preserve. She told him about the hospitals that had implemented traditional healing methods, about the physicians who had been trained in the integration of old and new medicine, about the federal policies that had been changed because of her research. And, "What about you?" she asked when she had finished. "What has life been like here?" Joseph's face grew more serious. "Difficult. The government has tried to take our children, to send them to boarding schools where they're forbidden to speak our language or practice our ways. We've had to fight to keep our families together, to maintain our culture while also adapting to the new world. But you've succeeded, Tobias observed. I can see it in the community. The language is still spoken. The traditions are still practiced. We've survived, Joseph corrected. But survival and thriving are different things. We need something more, something that will help our people not just endure, but flourish. What do you mean? Kira asked. Joseph leaned forward, his eyes intense. I mean, we need what you've built in the outside world. We need our own medical facility, our own school, our own way of combining the old knowledge with the new opportunities. We need you to come home, Kira, not just to visit, but to stay. The request hit Kira like a physical blow. In all her years of traveling and research, she had never seriously considered returning to the reservation permanently. Her work had been about documenting and preserving traditional knowledge, not about settling down and building a single institution. Joseph, I don't know if I can ... Let me show you something, he said, rising from his chair. Come with me. He led them outside and up a hill that overlooked the reservation. At the top stood the foundations of a building, carefully laid stone and timber that spoke of ambitious plans and careful construction. We've been planning this for 3 years, Joseph said. A medical center that would serve not just our people, but all the communities in this region. A place where traditional healing and modern medicine could work together, where our children could learn both the old ways and the new skills they need to succeed in the changing world. It's ambitious, Tobias said, examining the foundations, but it would work. There's a real need for this kind of facility. The problem is that we don't have the expertise to make it happen, Joseph continued. We need someone who understands both worlds, someone who has the training and the connections to make this vision a reality. You need me, Kira said, understanding. Flooding through her. We need you, Joseph confirmed. But more than that, we want you. You're part of this community, part of this family. You belong here. Kira walked to the edge of the hill, looking out over the reservation that had been her childhood home. Below, smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the yards, and adults went about the business of daily life. It was a community that had survived incredible hardship and maintained its identity despite enormous pressure to assimilate. What would you want me to do? She asked. Run the medical center, Joseph said. Teach our young people. Help us build something that will serve not just our generation, but generations to come. And I could continue my research? Your research would be part of the mission. We want to make this place a center for the study and preservation of traditional healing practices. A place where knowledge is not just preserved, but actively used to help people. Kira turned to Tobias, seeing the understanding in his eyes. What do you think? I think your brother is right, he said. I think this is what you've been working toward all along, even if you didn't realize it. But what about your work with the Marshal Service? The Territorial Marshal Service has been talking about establishing a permanent presence on the reservations, Tobias said. Someone who can work with tribal authorities to resolve conflicts and prevent violence. It would be a natural extension of the work I've been doing, so you'd stay too? Kira, I told you 10 years ago that wherever you go, that's where I want to be. I meant it then, and I mean it now. The decision, when it came, felt as inevitable as it had when they had first chosen to leave Helena. Within a month, Kira had negotiated a new arrangement with the Smithsonian that would allow her to continue her research while serving as the director of the new Hidatsa Medical Center. Tobias had accepted a position as the first Native American federal marshal assigned to reservation duty. The construction of the medical center became a community project, with families contributing labor, materials, and expertise. The building that rose from the foundations was a marvel of integrated design, incorporating traditional architectural elements with modern medical requirements. The center opened in the spring of 1887, and from the beginning it was clear that the vision had then realized. Patients came not just from the reservation, but from towns and settlements throughout the region, seeking treatment that combined the best of traditional healing with modern medical techniques. Kira found herself busier than she had ever been, serving simultaneously as a physician, a teacher, a researcher, and a cultural preservation specialist. But she also found herself happier than she had ever been, working among her own people while contributing to the broader understanding of medical science. The school that was established adjacent to the medical center became equally successful, offering a curriculum that included traditional Hidatsa knowledge alongside mathematics, reading, and science. Children learned to identify medicinal plants while also learning to read medical textbooks, to understand the spiritual aspects of healing while also mastering anatomy and physiology. "We're creating something new," Kira told Tobias one evening, as they walked through the reservation. "Not just preserving the old ways or adopting the new ones, but creating something that combines the best of both." "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. "Both of them." "I think they would be," Kira agreed. "I think they would understand that this is how cultures survive, not by staying exactly the same, but by adapting while maintaining their essential identity." As they walked, they passed the cemetery where generations of Hidatsa people had been laid to rest. Among the graves was a new stone, marking the resting place of an elderly woman who had been one of the last fluent speakers of the Funko traditional healing songs. "She taught me everything she knew before she died," Kira said, stopping beside the grave. "Her knowledge is now part of our permanent record, preserved for future generations." "And your children will learn it too," Tobias said. Kira's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, where the first signs of pregnancy were just beginning to show. They had kept the news to themselves for now, wanting to savor the joy privately before sharing it with the community. "Our children," she corrected. "They'll grow up knowing both worlds, understanding both traditions." "They'll grow up free," Tobias said. "Free to choose their own path, free to honor their heritage while building their own future." The word free hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Freedom had been the gift that Tobias had given Kira that day at the auction, but it had become something more over the years. It had become the foundation of their life together, the principle that guided their work and their relationship. As they continued their walk, they passed the medical center, its windows glowing with warm light as the evening shift tended to patients. From inside came the sound of voices speaking in Hidatsa, discussing symptoms and treatments in the language of their ancestors. "Do you ever think about that day at Bitter Creek?" Kira asked. "Sometimes," Tobias admitted, "but not with regret. Everything that happened led us here, to this moment, to this life we've built together. Even the terrible parts. Even the terrible parts. They taught us who we are, what we're capable of, what we're willing to fight for." They reached the hill, where they had first seen the foundations of the medical center, and they stopped to look out over the reservation. Below them, the community went about its evening routines, secure in the knowledge that their children were learning, their sick were being cared for, and their culture was being preserved and celebrated. "I love you, Tobias Stormwind," Kira said, taking his hand. "I love you too, Kira Moonhawk Stormwind," he replied. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days of our lives." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together on the hill, looking out over the life they had built from the ashes of tragedy. Behind them stood the medical center, a testament to the power of combining wisdom and innovation. Before them lay the future, uncertain but bright with possibility. The wind carried the scent of sage and sweetgrass across the prairie, the same plants that had been used by their people for generations to heal and to bless. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the vast landscape, a sound that no longer represented escape but rather connection, a link between their community and the wider world. Kira smiled, knowing that they had completed a circle that had begun in a cage at a frontier auction and had led them through years of struggle and growth to this moment of peace and purpose. They had not just survived their ordeals. They had transformed them into something beautiful and lasting. The child growing within her would be born into a world where traditional healing was respected science, where Native American voices were heard in government councils, where love could transcend the boundaries of race and culture. It would be a world they had helped to create, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of compassion at a time. And as the night deepened around them, Kira and Tobias knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.